Hello there. Hello students, my name's Peter and I'm the Dungeon Doctor. This is the latest video in my Monk Masterclass series, where we look at how we can get the most out of every single Monk subclass. Today I'm going to be looking at the way of the Kensei, and honestly, the best way to optimize this build really stumped me for a while. The Kensei Monk incorporates both damage dealing features in the form of damage and accuracy boosts, as well as a unique way to boost their defense in the form of agile parry. It also seems to encourage a player to make use of both ranged and melee weapons. Because of this, for the longest time, I thought I'd need to make two separate builds for this subclass, one which excelled at tanking and another at damage dealing with a ranged weapon. But then it's like a switch flipped in my head. Why not do both? The idea of a martial character who excels in both melee and ranged fights isn't often explored in optimized builds. But the reality is there's a lot of value to having this versatility in combat. At the same time, having a character who can deal significant damage actually makes them more attractive as a tank. When a dungeon master decides which character to target with their monsters, generally they will be most concerned with disrupting the biggest threat on the battlefield. Ranged attackers who are dealing a lot of damage are just such a target. They can engage with potentially multiple creatures from a distance, and the damage they deal ensures that those creatures, or the DM, will treat them as a significant threat. Not only this, when an enemy gets into melee range of a character, that character will then have disadvantage on their ranged attack rolls. This gives the Dungeon Master an even bigger incentive to target that character in combat. Of course, there are ways to get around this as a player. Feats like Crossbow Expert prevent us from having disadvantage on our ranged attacks in melee. But for a switch, we don't necessarily want to get around that disadvantage. Whether the Dungeon Master intends it or not, they will realise that there's less incentive to approaching a character with Crossbow Expert in melee, and this will affect their decision making on who to target. So in a sense, we want to give the DM that win, because it works in our favour as a tank. That win means we can draw enemies to a particular part of the battlefield, such as to bottlenecks or just positions away from vulnerable allies. Melee tanks often don't have that luxury. They have to move to where the enemy is and hope that it's a good position on the battlefield. And while we might lose some of our damage dealing capabilities when a monster moves into melee with us, as a switch character, we should be able to easily swap to using melee weapons effectively, in addition to being able to tank attacks. So this defines our switch. On one hand, a long-range damage dealer, and on the other, a close-range tank. But before we can discuss how we achieve this with the Kensei Monk, let's review their subclass features. At level 3, Kensei Monks receive 4 features. With Kensei weapons, they can at level 3 choose one ranged and one melee weapon to be their Kensei weapons. These can be any weapons without the special or heavy properties, with the exception of the longbow, which is also a valid option. These weapons become monk weapons for that character, so if the monk's martial arts die is higher than their weapon damage die, they can use that instead. It also means they can use dexterity to wield strength-based weapons, such as longswords. This is a pretty nice feature which ensures this monk subclass is compatible with weapons they can't normally use without impacting on features like martial arts. It also makes it easier to optimize them for using damage dealing feats like sharpshooter, although I really wish they could utilise heavy melee weapons like the glaive, as I really enjoy the aesthetic of monks wielding a range of interesting melee weaponry. Kensei weapons also allows this subclass to use certain subclass features, like agile parry. With agile parry, if the monk uses an attack action and uses it to attack with an unarmed strike while they're holding a melee Kensei weapon, they gain a +2 to armor class until the start of their next turn. This is a welcome buff to a monk's defense, as typically they struggle to achieve high enough armor class to last long in melee. It's also a reliable, resource-free way to gain quite a large bonus to armor class, so is a very attractive feature to build a tank around. Speaking of which, we did just this in the Bladesinger Monk build, link up here. Kensei Monks also gain Kensei's Shot. With this, they can, as a bonus action, give a 1d4 boost to the damage of all their ranged attacks with Kensei weapons for that turn. This is a cost-free path to getting more damage out of our bonus action. Often ranged characters will grab a feat like Crossbow Expert to achieve this. While a feat like Crossbow Expert is undoubtedly better than Kensei's Shot, it costs the character one of their few feats. And Kensei's shot clearly gets stronger with the more attacks we can make, so features like extra attack and action surge can help us get the most out of it. Kensei's shot also doesn't use our concentration, so we could stack it with concentration spells that also buff our damage. For example, Divine Favour, Hex or Hunter's Mark. By doing this, we can add multiple damage modifiers to all of our attacks for a single round. And lastly, at level 3, Kenseis get a ribbon feature in the Way of the Brush, which gives them proficiency in calligraphy or painter's tools. We're a monk of culture, so this feature helps reinforce the flavour of an Eastern flavoured warrior like a samurai. At level 6, Kensei monks gain 2 more features: Magic Kensei weapons and Deft Strike. They can also choose another Kensei weapon, which can be either a ranged or melee weapon with the same restrictions as before. With Magic Kensei weapons, all attacks we make with Kensei weapons deal magical damage. This is useful for ensuring we're always doing consistent damage. Although in most campaigns we shouldn't have to worry about gaining at least one magical weapon around this level. Where it can come in handy though is where certain magical weapons are rare, so this feature ensures our Kensei weapon choices are relevant even if we aren't likely to gain a magical version of them. Deft Strike meanwhile allows us to add a martial arts die of damage to a Kensei weapon attack which hits, and we can only do this once on each of our turns and it costs us 1 key point to do it. Additional buffs to damage are nice, but this feels too expensive for the amount of extra damage we're gaining. If we look back on Fangs of the Fire Snake from the Way of 4 Elements, that would give us a d10 of fire damage for each key point as low as level 3, and we could use it multiple times a turn if we wanted to go Nova on a creature. Deft Strike won't give us a d10 until we reach very high levels. For most subclasses in D&D, a feature like this wouldn't have a resource cost. You'd just get a small bit of extra damage each turn. However, if we're using the Keyfield attack feature from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, then Deft Strike can be a reliable way to give us an additional attack with our bonus action. Also, if we score a critical hit on a creature, then just like with a Paladin's Smite, we would be able to roll twice as many dice. Because of this, I think I would only use this feature if we're using Keyfield attack, or if I was sure the damage would make a difference, or if I had just dealt a critical hit. At level 11, we gain Sharpen the Blade. As a bonus action, we can spend up to 3 key points to give a Kensei weapon we're using a bonus to damage and attack rolls equal to the key points we spend. And this effect lasts for 1 minute. Considering +3 weapons are considered very rare, this is a pretty good buff and pairs well with features like Sharpshooter if we're trying to improve our accuracy. But it can only be used on weapons which don't already have a bonus to attack or damage rolls, so we're limited in what we can apply it to. Although Jeremy Crawford has clarified that weapons such as Flame Tongues and Frostbrands are eligible choices, so I guess provided the bonus isn't a static 1, 2 or 3 to our accuracy or damage, then we should be fine. So this feature does get way better if we can use it to buff a already magical weapon. Finally, at level 17 we gain Unerring Accuracy. With this, once per turn, we can reroll an attack with a monk weapon which misses. It's a nice buff to our attacks and again supports a build that uses features like Sharpshooter, but for a high level feature it doesn't feel disruptive enough to justify sticking with this monk subclass to such high levels. So let's review. Firstly, I really like the flavour of this subclass. It leans into the samurai archetype, which is a popular fantasy trope. It also emphasises the idea of a master of both ranged and melee weapons, which, as I suggested, is quite unique in Dungeons & Dragons. The features are mostly centred around improving the damage we deal with Kensei weapons, the exception being Agile Parry, which can let this monk engage in melee, where other monks struggle, thanks to the boost to their armour class. But it's already possible to achieve this same fantasy with other martial classes, like a dexterity-based fighter or ranger, and they will excel at these roles better, generally. So it raises the question of what's unique or powerful about this approach. While Monk has the benefit of gaining the Stunning Strike feature, this subclass pushes them towards going more towards dexterity than wisdom, and so Stunning Strike isn't going to be as reliable a feature as it would be on other monks. What I think is powerful and unique is the switch nature of this subclass, being master of multiple forms of combat, and I think this is what we're going to emphasise in what I'm going to dub the Way of the samurai. But before that, if you're enjoying the content so far, then please do take the time to pop a like and comment below, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. This is a small channel, and your support really goes a long way. I also respond to pretty much every comment I receive, so I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the build and perhaps what you'd like to see next. For the way of the samurai, I think it's crucial that we pick up sharpshooter as early as possible, preferably from level 1. Which means we're better off using either variant human or custom lineage. I don't feel too bad for this limitation. Most builds which are looking to maximise weapon damage are in the same boat as us, but we'll be doing something quite different with it as we level up. However, if you do want to go with a different race, then pick up sharpshooter when you reach level 4 in a class. This will put us a little bit behind on our accuracy, but this build only needs 1 feat to work, so delaying picking it up until then isn't going to hurt your build too much. The sharpshooter feat has many effects. Firstly, it allows us to attack creatures with the long range of a ranged weapon without having disadvantage on their attack roll. Sharpshooter also allows us to ignore the effects of cover, such as partial cover giving a +2 to an enemy's armor class, or full cover giving them a +5 to their armor class. However, the most important feature of sharpshooter is the ability to add more damage to a roll. So, when we make an attack roll, we can choose to take a -5 penalty to the attack roll. If that attack then still hits, we get a +10 to the damage that we deal. This is considered one of the best ways to make martial weapon damage really applicable in the game of D&D, and helps them stack up against spellcasters. By applying sharpshooter to multiple hits in a single turn, we can potentially rack up a lot of damage in a single round of combat. This is why it's so important to pick it up as early as you can on something like a ranged character who's really focusing on making a lot of ranged attacks, as this is going to allow us to become a prominent threat on the battlefield. For this build, we're going for a very unconventional array of ability scores for a monk. Rather than focusing on our dexterity, we'll instead be focusing much more on our strength. If we go for variant human and use the point buy method as always, we'll have the following ability scores. We'll have a strength of 15, which will add a +1 from our ability score increase from our race. We'll have a dexterity of 13, which I think I'll put our remaining +1 into. A constitution of 14, an intelligence of 8, a wisdom of 13, and a charisma of 9. If we go for custom lineage, we can instead choose to boost our strength a little bit higher. So we'd have a strength of 15, which we'd add a +2 to from our race, taking it all the way to 17. We'd then have a dexterity of 13, a constitution of 14, an intelligence of 8, a wisdom of 13, and again a charisma of 9. The progression of both these options is pretty much the same. The variant human is a bit more balanced overall, but custom lineage would allow us to pick up a useful half feat at level 4 in a class, so both are great options. For our skills from our background, we should definitely pick up athletics. We'll have a very high strength score, so this will let us make the most out of grappling, tripping and shoving creatures. I'd also consider picking up stealth to lean into the ninja aspects of this build. Level 1. Fighter 1. At level 1 we're going with Fighter. This is going to get us proficiency in strength and constitution saving throws. It's also going to give us proficiency in all martial weapons and armour. This is going to be a very tanky build, so we're going to be wearing the best possible heavy armour that we can. We're also going to wear a shield, so from level 1 we're going to have at least an armour class of 18 thanks to chainmail and a shield, and eventually we'll have an armour class of 20 when we pick up plate mail. This may seem a little bit confusing at first glance. We've picked up sharpshooter, but we're also using a shield, so how are we meant to make a ranged attack with a bow? That's the neat part. We don't. Because for our fighting style, we're going to be taking the thrown weapon fighting style from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. With this fighting style, we get to add a +2 to all our damage rolls with thrown weapons. We're also going to be able to draw a weapon whenever we attack with it, so when we pick up extra attack later, we can still use both our attacks to throw stuff. And the weapon we're going to be throwing most is the humble dart, which for this build, I suggest we reflavor to being something akin to like a shuriken or throwing star. So why choose a dart? Firstly, the dart is a ranged weapon, meaning we can use it in combination with sharpshooter. It also has the finesse property. This means we can use either strength or dexterity to use it. Normally the finesse property is utilised as use dexterity instead of strength for melee weapons such as rapiers or daggers. However, in this case, we're going to do the opposite. This means that we can utilise our high strength in combination with the sharpshooter feat, which is a unique niche. The dart has a normal range of 20 foot, but a long range of 60 foot. Because of sharpshooter, we don't have disadvantage on our ranged attacks at long range, so we can make the most of that 60 foot range. 60 foot should be sufficient range in most combats to reach enemies, and in any case, we don't want to be too distant from enemies as we want them to move towards us instead of to allies. Lastly, let's discuss damage. The dart is of course a thrown weapon, meaning we get that +2 damage from our fighting style to each attack we make with them. This helps make up for its low damage die of just 1d4. With the thrown weapon fighting style, the dart has an average damage of about 4.5 damage before we add our strength modifier, which is actually the average damage of a longbow. All told, our usual attacks deal about 7.5 damage, or 17.5 if we use sharpshooter. But when should we use sharpshooter? Often builds will take the archery fighting style to boost their hit rate with ranged weapons, making using sharpshooter on every hit much more viable. We won't have that benefit until much higher levels, so it's worth keeping in mind we aren't playing our characters in a vacuum. Most parties have at least 3 other players involved, each with a broad range of different spells or features. And many of these can grant martial characters advantage on their attacks. Or if not advantage, there are spells like Bless that can grant us a d4 to our attack rolls. Or features like Bardic Inspiration can boost our attack rolls by at least a d6. Because of this, we will want to use our sharpshooter feat when the situation gives us advantage or a buff to our attack roll. Or when we're confident the armor class of a creature is quite low, which is quite obvious for creatures like beasts, oozes, and some undead. That and huge creatures often have a lower armor class which reflects them being a bigger target. And we will gain ways to grant ourselves advantage as we level up. Otherwise, we can just enjoy consistent damage from our thrown weapons. The one thing to really note with thrown weapons like darts is that we can use our shield in combination with them, whereas things like crossbows, longbows always require at least 2 hands. Even a one-handed weapon like a hand crossbow requires a free hand to load a new bolt into it. Because we can wield a shield and plate armor in combination with using the sharpshooter feat, we have a build which is going to have both a very high armor class and the ability to deal a lot of damage at range, which is perfect for our switch fighter. Our tactics would be to move to a position we want to draw the enemy towards, usually away from our spellcaster allies, and then hit them with a powerful attack. With this, we've made ourselves an attractive target because we're dealing a lot of damage, and when creatures are within 5 foot of us, then we have disadvantage on our ranged attack rolls. However, when those creatures are within 5 feet of us, we've made ourselves very hard to hit, and we can easily swap to a melee weapon to continue dealing decent damage. Speaking of which, let's discuss some other weapon options. As well as being able to throw our shurikens or throwing stars, we may want to consider throwing a net. Note that nets use our dexterity modifier for the attack roll, so if we went with Variant Human, then we've still got a +4 modifier to the hit, which isn't bad. But crucially, we also have the sharpshooter feat. This means we can throw the net up to 15 feet and not have disadvantage on the attack roll. It's worth noting that with nets, unless you have something like the sharpshooter feat or the crossbow expert feat, you're never going to be in a situation where you can throw a net without having disadvantage on the roll. This is because nets have either a short range of 5 foot, meaning that you're always within melee range of a creature when you use it, and a long range of 15 feet, which you can't use without disadvantage unless you have sharpshooter. If an attack with our net hits and the creature is large or smaller, then they are restrained and there's no saving throw to prevent this from happening. To end the effect, the creature then needs to either use its action to make a strength check, or make an attack with slashing damage against the net. Because we have the thrown weapon fighting style, we can throw a net, and on the same turn still use our free action to draw a melee weapon. However, we won't be able to use the net in combination with a second attack if we're doing it as part of a attack action with extra attack. This is because the rules of the net stipulate that once you've used a net to attack with your attack action, you can't make any further attacks using that action. Throwing a net at a creature is a good way to potentially set us up for sharpshooter on later attacks, as it will give us advantage to those attacks. Nets also help make up for the fact that we won't be making much use of Stunning Strike on this build, so it's a good option if we do want a control feature. For other weapons, we may want to consider unequipping our shield and instead using a weapon that requires 2 hands, such as a longbow. If a creature is very far away, then we can snipe at them using the long range of our longbow, which is 600 feet. However, our modifier at this level with a longbow is only a +4, so it's certainly not worth using with sharpshooter unless we're really confident we've got enough modifiers and advantage on the attack. Of course, for many distant enemies, we may prefer to use a javelin, which has a long range of 120 feet. With a d6 damage die and our +2 to damage, it'll deal some decent damage at this level. However, because javelins are considered a melee weapon which are then thrown, they won't be able to benefit from the additional damage from sharpshooter. I really love how this character seems to be able to make great use of a huge range of weapons. It truly feels like a master of martial weapons, able to pick up and use anything that they find on the battlefield to great effect. It reminds me a lot of the duel scene from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where the more experienced combatant is showing their prowess with multiple weapons. It's also a common trope in a lot of kung fu movies where a character might be picking up various weapons and showing their proficiency with them against multiple different combatants. Level 2. Fighter 1, Monk 1. At level 2 we're going to pick up a Monk level. I'm not going to lie, this level isn't going to feel like it improves our character in a meaningful way. We don't benefit from unarmoured defense since we're already well armoured, and we can't use the martial arts feature of the class while wearing armour either. Unequipping the armour and shield is always going to be an option for us, although it does take some time, so we'd have to be confident we don't need to take many hits anytime soon. This will become a more attractive option to us as our martial arts die and our unarmoured movement increases. Personally, if the party were engaging in some kind of stealth mission where we'd want to avoid having disadvantage on stealth checks and have more mobility options, then I'd perhaps go for it. But otherwise, I would assume our character wears armour and a shield in most situations. Level 3. Fighter 1, Monk 2. Now we begin to gain some Monk features we can use. Level 2, we gain Ki. Firstly, let's discuss Flurry of Blows. After we take an attack action, we can spend a bonus action and 1 key point to make 2 unarmed strikes. While wearing armour, we won't be able to add our martial arts die to the damage we deal with these attacks. However, we do get to add our strength modifier to the damage. Currently, we would therefore deal 4 damage per hit with an unarmed strike. It's not great damage, but if we're faced with a situation where some chip damage can drop another enemy before their turn, then it's worth using. It's also worth noting that our attack rolls will be able to use our strength modifier as well, so as we increase in level, our accuracy with our unarmed strikes won't decrease. If we aren't wearing armour, then the average damage is instead about 5.5 per hit, which honestly isn't that big an improvement. We also gain Step of the Wind. With this, we can spend a key point and a bonus action to take either the dash or disengage action. This makes up for the fact that while wearing armour, we won't gain additional movement speed from unarmoured movement. We don't strictly need this additional movement as a ranged fighter, but sometimes being able to double our movement or step away from a melee without taking opportunity attacks will be beneficial. Step of the Wind also doubles our jump distance. Currently our long jump is equal to 16 foot and our high jump is 6 foot. With Step of the Wind, it will increase to 32 feet and 12 feet respectively. As we've seen with earlier builds, these jump distances can give us unique movement options not available to other characters. We can reach enemies other characters cannot. We can also potentially jump over creatures if they're blocking it where we want to move to. Arguably, medium-sized creatures won't even get an attack of opportunity, as our high jump of 12 feet would be just outside their reach. Lastly, we gain patient defense, which I think is the best use for our key points. With this, we can spend a key point and a bonus action to take the dodge action. This puts all attacks against us at disadvantage and gives us advantage on our dexterity saving throws. Combining the dodge action with our very high armor class makes us very difficult to hit, letting us fill the tank role really well. Level 4. Fighter 1, Monk 3. We now gain our subclass, the Way of the Kensei. As discussed, we'll gain 4 subclass features from this: Kensei Weapons, Agile Parry, Kensei Shot, and the Way of the Brush. As a reminder, with Kensei Weapons, we can nominate 2 weapons to be considered monk weapons, so long as they have neither the heavy or special property. Also, one must be a melee weapon, and the other must be a ranged weapon. However, we can nominate an additional weapon whenever we gain a subclass feature, and that can be from either melee or ranged options. For our ranged weapon, we certainly want to have darts as our Kensei weapon. Otherwise, pick whichever melee weapon we use most often. Personally, I would go for a longsword, as this fits the katana aesthetic closest, and it has a good damage die. With Agile Parry, while we're wielding a Kensei weapon, which is a melee weapon, but instead use our action to make an unarmed strike, our armor class increases by 2. This means we can lean even further into tanking, increasing our armor class to a maximum of 22 if we're wearing plate mail and a shield. And we can use it in combination with dodge on the same turn to make us even more difficult to hit. We just need to make sure our Kensei weapon is in our hand. Thankfully, because we throw our ranged weapons and have the throwing fighting style, our free hand is reliably empty, and we can still use our free object interaction to draw a new weapon that turn, so we can easily switch between melee and ranged attack modes. Again, our damage with unarmed strikes isn't fantastic while we're using them as part of Agile Parry, but at least they use our strength modifier, so the damage isn't nothing and we still have a good hit rate with it. With Kensei Shot, we can use a bonus action to improve the damage our Kensei weapons deals by 1d4, and this lasts until the end of our current turn. This gives us a decent buff to our damage just using our bonus action, and partly makes up for the fact that we aren't going for an option which weaponizes our bonus action, such as with Crossbow Expert. It's worth noting that neither Agile Parry or Kensei Shot use our ki, so we can save our ki points for patient defense when we are in melee. Kensei Shot means our darts deal reliable damage now, with each dart dealing 2d4 plus 2 from our fighting style and a plus 3 from our strength modifier, for an average of 10 damage. And if we hit with Sharpshooter, the damage is instead 20, which is pretty good at this level. Notably, it is possible to do better damage by going straight fighter and getting both Sharpshooter and Crossbow Expert as early as possible. However, keep in mind that this is a switch build, so while it doesn't beat that option in raw damage, it's going to be able to fill the tank role much better. Lastly, we gain with the brush. This is a nice bit of flavour to add to our character, letting us lean into the refined martial artist archetype. Outside of our subclass features, we also gain Deflect missiles. This is really great, as often we will be at range from enemies and so will be targeted by missile attacks. With Deflect missiles, we'll be able to mitigate that damage, which is going to help enhance our role as a tank. While Deflect missiles does rely partly on our dexterity, it also relies on our overall monk level, so it will scale pretty well as we get into higher levels. If we completely mitigate the damage from a missile thrown at us, we can spend 1 key point and our reaction to use it to make a ranged attack. Now, brace yourselves, because this feature is going to get very complicated on this build. Firstly, our attack with the thrown weapon from Deflect missiles has a normal range of 20 feet or a long range of 60 feet. Simple enough, we're making a ranged attack roll, and we can throw those objects as far as 60 feet without having disadvantage on the attack roll, thanks to Sharpshooter. But what about the additional damage from Sharpshooter and thrown weapon fighting? I think the most reasonable thing to consider is what weapon was thrown our way. If we, for example, caught a dart, then presumably that is still considered a ranged weapon. Meanwhile, a javelin we catch is still a melee weapon, which can be used to make a ranged attack. So I think a simple interpretation is, if the original weapon could be used to get the extra damage from sharpshooter, or if it could benefit from the extra damage from thrown weapon attack, then we can use those features as part of the attack we make with deflect missiles. Not only this, but while all deflected weapons are considered monk weapons that we're proficient in, if we catch a weapon such as a javelin, spear, or other thrown weapon which allows us to use strength, then we can use our strength for the damage and attack rolls. We can use the damage die of the weapon, and we can apply the +2 bonus from thrown weapon fighting. This actually makes spending a key point on deflect missiles a really attractive option for us. However, weapons like arrows are trickier. While they are used as part of a ranged attack, they're not a weapon in and of themselves. They're considered ammunition. The general consensus seems to be that we can use improvised weapons as ranged attacks. However, sharpshooter stipulates we need to be proficient in the weapon in order for it to benefit from that feature's damage boosting abilities. Thankfully, deflect missiles does just this, as it stipulates we make this attack with proficiency. Now, arguably, this does not mean we are proficient in the weapon, but this would require an overly literal interpretation of the rules. Additionally, the rules for improvised weapons gives us further details on the nature of deflected arrows. Firstly, the damage die of all improvised weapons is a d4, unless the improvised weapon could be approximated by some equivalent weapon. For example, a table leg might be considered a great club because it's visually similar to it. Now, normally the deflected weapons are considered monk weapons, meaning we can use our martial arts die for the damage. But while we're wearing armor, we don't have that additional benefit from it being a monk weapon. This means when we throw something that's an improvised weapon, such as an arrow, we have to use the improvised weapon rules to determine what the damage is, which, as we saw, the damage die for an improvised weapon is also a d4, which means that we're just causing the same damage we would do with an arrow as if we were a low-level monk. So by wearing armor, we're only losing out on a little bit of extra damage as we scale up in monk levels. But what ability score do we use for throwing an arrow? Typically ranged attacks are assumed to use dexterity. However, almost without exception, thrown weapons allow us to use both strength or dexterity modifiers for the attack and damage rolls. The exceptions are the net, which only uses dexterity, or the light hammer and hand axe, which typically only use strength. This is where looking at the improvised weapon rules in the player's handbook again can help. The rules suggest that an improvised weapon can be approximated by an existing weapon's stats at the DM's discretion. And I don't believe I'm being biased when I say that the closest existing weapon we have to an arrow is a dart, which again uses either strength or dexterity. Because of this, I think it's reasonable to assume that when we catch and throw an arrow, we can use our strength modifier for the attack and damage rolls, we benefit from the additional damage from thrown weapon fighting, and we can gain the damage boost from sharpshooter as a part of the attack. There's a lot of crunchy rules to this interpretation, so discuss it with your DM, but I can't really see any reasonable arguments to the contrary against my interpretation. Who knew deflecting missiles could be so powerful or complicated? Level 5. Fighter 1, Monk 4. We gain an ability score improvement or feat, and for this it is actually very tempting to pick up the archery fighting style as a feat, as this will improve our accuracy with sharpshooter. However, we will be able to pick up the archery fighting style later, so we'll instead grab a +2 to strength to increase our accuracy and our martial abilities all round. If we went with custom lineage, this is where we'd instead grab a half feat and increase our strength by 1 point. Piercer would be really good on this to boost our damage output a little bit further, and if we had this in mind, we'd potentially have chosen a rapier as our melee Kensei weapon, so that our melee attacks as well as our ranged attacks deal piercing damage. Another great half feat is Skill Expert, which would allow us to pick up expertise in athletics. This could make our grappling, tripping, and our shoving really reliable. Personally though, on this build, I think I would pick up Heavy Armor Master. I've seen this feat be decisive in letting tanks take way more hits than they would otherwise, as the few hits that they do take from physical damage are each reduced by 3 points. Additionally, it complements the Deflect missiles feature that we picked up at level 3 Monk. It's unclear whether we would apply the damage mitigation effect from Heavy Armor Master before or after we use Deflect missiles. If we apply it before, it improves our chances of completely mitigating ranged damage, giving us the opportunity then catch and throw the incoming weapon. However, a reasonable interpretation would be we reduce the damage with Deflect missiles with our hands before the weapon can then reach our armor. In this case, while we might be able to reduce the incoming damage entirely with Heavy Armor Master, we won't then be able to catch and throw it, as we didn't reduce the damage to 0 using the Deflect missiles feature. At level 4, we also gain Slow Fall. As we have the ability to jump very high and far, there are good chances this will be a useful ability for us to have. By this level, our strength is 18, whether we went with custom lineage or variant human. So our usual long jump and high jump are 18 feet and 7 feet respectively, while when we use Step of the Wind, our long jump is 36 feet and our high jump is 14 feet. I think it's reasonable to assume that when we use Step of the Wind, we can leap over large creatures now, potentially without taking attack of opportunity depending on where the DM rules it can reach. Level 6, Fighter 1, Monk 5. At level 6 we gain extra attack. This is very welcome, as until now we've been limited to making just one attack per turn with our darts. Attacking twice greatly increases our overall damage, and what's more, we can apply Kensei's shot to both attacks that we make. So we have reliable damage whether we choose to use Sharpshooter or not. We also gain Stunning Strike. However, on this build our wisdom is quite low, so it won't be often we use this feature. If we're using the optional rules from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, we may now have access to both the Keyfield attack feature and Focused Aim. With Focused Aim, we can spend up to 3 key points to add a modifier to an attack roll we've just made, with a +2 added for each key point we spend. This is great, as without access to the archery fighting style, we are lagging behind in our ranged attack's accuracy. Not only this, but with Keyfield attack, provided we spend a key point as part of our action on something like Focused Aim, we can then make an additional attack with an unarmed strike or monk weapon as a bonus action. Because of this, if we're using these features, we can potentially make up to 3 attacks with our darts each round. And because none of our features are otherwise expending ki, we have a lot of opportunities to use Keyfield attack in this way. If we aren't making use of these features, or we just want to play more defensively, we could reserve all 5 of our key points for patient defense. At 1 key point per round of combat, these key points can actually now go a really long way in making us very defensive in most combats. Level 7, Fighter 1, Monk 5, Ranger 1. Now that we've gotten the extra attack feature, we really need to look at picking up the archery fighting style, and the quickest way to do this is to start investing in Ranger levels. A level 1 Ranger, we don't gain a lot unless we're using optional features from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. However, unlike the monk features discussed earlier, which are optional features we gain on top of our usual features, the optional class features from Ranger are usually replacements for existing features and go a long way to making the Ranger's features feel relevant. So if we're using these optional features, we would then gain Canny and Favoured Foe. With Canny, we would gain expertise in a skill we're proficient in. At this point, I would pick up expertise in athletics if we haven't already using skill expert, but we might also want to consider stealth if we want to lean more into that ninja aesthetic, and also try to mitigate the disadvantage on stealth checks from wearing heavy armor. Meanwhile, Favoured Foe allows us proficiency bonus times per day to designate an enemy we hit with an attack as our favoured foe. On that hit, and once per turn afterwards, we can deal an extra d4 of damage to that enemy. This is another small buff to our damage, which stacks with our Kensei shot, meaning that we're starting to stack up multiple sources of damage onto our attacks, which is very nice. If we don't gain these 2 optional Ranger features, I would simply pick your favourite terrain and enemy and hope they're relevant in your campaign. Level 8, Fighter 1, Monk 5, Ranger 2. At Ranger 2, however, we are finally going to pick up the archery fighting style. With this, we gain a +2 modifier to our attack rolls, meaning our accuracy with ranged weapons is much better, so we can use sharpshooter more reliably. There was an option to pick this fighting style at level 1 with Fighter 1, and then wait until this level to pick up the thrown weapon fighting style. This will have made sharpshooter more reliable at lower levels, but if we're following rules as written, it would also have meant we couldn't throw more than a single dart in one turn. This would have been especially painful if we were using key field attack to make 3 dart attacks per turn. Some tables though would just ignore this rule, in which case you can pick whichever order for picking up these fighting styles that you fancy. Although the consistent damage that darts deal at low level thanks to thrown weapon fighting style isn't insignificant, so you might still want to go with the order I've presented here. At Ranger 2, we also gain spells. As we saw with the werewolf build, picking up the jump spell and combining it with our high strength and step of the wind feature will give us very impressive long and high jump distances, so let's certainly pick up that. I also really like Zephyr Strike, as the ability to move in and out of melee easily is perfect on this build, and the advantage on an attack is very useful for improving sharpshooter's damage. But I think we'll pick this spell up when we reach our 3rd level in Ranger, because I don't think we can pass up taking Hunter's Mark at this level. As a bonus action, we can mark a creature, and all future attacks on them will deal an additional d6 of damage. What's great about this is that this can stack with both Favoured Foe and Kensei Shot. So if we have a single big monster we're attacking, we could slowly snowball our damage as over 2 rounds we begin adding more ways to add damage modifiers to our attacks. It feels almost like we're learning more about our enemies' weaknesses as we fight them. It also lasts for an hour, so we can continue to target additional creatures with it using only our bonus action, which is great as we only have 2 spell slots. This spell is also why I really wanted to start with Fighter 1, as that gave us proficiency in Constitution saving throws, which will help us maintain our concentration on this spell. Level 9, Fighter 1, Monk 6, Ranger 2. At level 9 we're going to return to Monk for a level. This gives us our subclass features Death Strike and Magic Kensei weapons. Magic Kensei weapons is incredibly useful on this build, because without it we would need to have a lot of magical darts to overcome resistance to non-magical damage. Having a magical melee weapon would have helped us mitigate that, but we really want to be able to keep our sharpshooter damage relevant. We also gain Death Strike. This is quite a weak feature, as once per turn for 1 key point it will increase the damage we deal with a weapon by our martial arts die. This is a d6, which isn't a big return, but if we're using key field attack in combination with it, then it might be worth using. Also, we may want to hold out for when we get a critical hit before we use it, as this will double the dice we roll for damage. Although we should note that Death Strike does stack with our other forms of damage. So now we could potentially stack Kensei Shot, Death Strike, Favoured Foe, and potentially Hunter's Mark if we set that up on a previous turn. This would be 2d4 plus 2d6 on top of one of our usual attacks, which is equivalent to about 12 extra points of damage. We should also keep in mind that all the damage dice would double if we managed to somehow get a critical hit. So while individually our extra damage isn't doing much, the overall snowballing of damage as we progress to higher levels is starting to get really noticeable. At this level, we could also pick up an additional Kensei weapon. Let's maybe go with the longbow. Our dexterity score isn't very high, but when we're in need of a weapon that can reach 600 feet, then we'll be glad to have this as an option for our monk features. Level 10, Fighter 1, Monk 6, Ranger 3. At level 10, we're going to go back to Ranger to gain our subclass. And naturally, we're going to go with Gloomstalker Ranger. This is going to give us the Dread Ambusher feature, giving us a small boost to our initiative equal to our Wisdom modifier. Additionally, on the first round of combat, our speed increases by 10 feet, and we gain an additional attack on our first turn. This additional attack deals an extra d8 of damage on a hit. This makes using Kensei Shot or Hunter's Mark as a bonus action pretty attractive on our first turn, as while we may lose an additional attack from something like Keyfield Strike, we will be gaining a decent bit of additional damage to all our other attacks. Additionally, with Gloomstalker, we gain Umbral Sight. This is going to give us Dark Vision of 60 feet or potentially 90 feet if we picked up Dark Vision earlier from Custom Lineage. Additionally, while we're in darkness, we're hidden from creatures who are relying on Dark Vision to see. This potentially gives us an easy way to trigger advantage on our attacks, which is very much appreciated when we're making attacks with Sharpshooter. It does make us less attractive as a tank though, so consider moving out of the darkness to draw enemies to you when you do want to draw them in. Level 11, Fighter 1, Monk 6, Ranger 4. At level 11, we would take an additional level in Ranger to get an ability score increase. With this, we would cap off our strength at 20. So let's review our jumping capabilities. Our standard long jump and high jump are 20 feet and 8 feet respectively, which is already remarkable. With Step of the Wind, our long jump becomes 40 feet and our high jump 16 feet. This is getting pretty high, to the point we could leap onto small buildings with ease. But with both Step of the Wind and jump active, we have a 6 times multiplier. So our long jump is 180 feet and our high jump is 48 feet. Incredibly high and a great tool for exploration or combat depending on the terrain. To make the most of this, we may need to unequip our armor so we can increase our movement speed. With a movement speed of 45 feet or 55 feet if it's our first round of combat, we could leap perhaps 110 feet if we take the dash action, and perhaps further if we're able to double dash and set up our jump spell ahead of time. With slow fall, we're able to reduce fall damage by 30 points, so if we do have to worry about fall damage from jumping so high, we should be fine. I should also point out that with a strength of 20, our unarmed strikes will be dealing 5 points of damage, and while this isn't much, we can stack effects like Hunter's Mark with them, meaning we can potentially deal solid additional damage with Flurry of Blows when we're caught in melee. And finally, for our level 12 capstone. Level 12, Fighter 2, Monk 6, Ranger 4. Finally, for our level 12 capstone, we're going to take Fighter 2 and Action Surge. The Gloomstalker Ranger Fighter 2 combination is pretty well known. With it, we can make up to 6 attacks on our first turn, 3 with our first attack action thanks to Dread Ambusher, and a second set of 3 because of Action Surge. And with our bonus action, we can either lay on a Hunter's Mark on a single creature, or we can use Kensei Shot to apply extra damage to each of those 6 shots. Or we could use Keyfield Attack to potentially make a 7th attack if this option is available to us. So at level 12, we've given ourselves a very potent opening shot in combat, which I'm sure is going to draw a lot of attention from creatures towards us. Alternatively, we might want to consider using an Action Surge to unequip a shield in battle. It'll cost us a lot of potential damage and attacks. However, if we're in a position where we can't otherwise use our attacks because we're long range, then it could be worth doing this, as it will allow us to then use our longbow for attacks. So, where do we go after level 12? I think adding more fighter levels would be useful, as we could then round up our fighter levels to 4. Along the way though, we would then be able to pick up something like Eldritch Knight. Among other things, the Eldritch Knight subclass would allow us to pick up the Shield and Find Familiar spells, which would allow us to pump our armor class further and gain advantage on an attack using our Owl Familiar's help action. Because we have 4 levels in Ranger and 3 in Eldritch Knight, we would have access to 2nd level spell slots, so consider picking spells that have some scaling to them, like Absorb Elements. For our spells, we should note that we need a free hand to cast a spell like Shield, so this would perhaps be more helpful when we have not yet wielded our melee weapon, such as while we're still attacking from range. Or we may at this point consider not equipping our shield. The boost to armor class we gain from the shield spell more than makes up for the loss of armor class, and having a free hand will help us utilize spellcasting in combination with our ranged and melee attacks. I'm also a big fan of Weapon Bond from Eldritch Knight. On Switch fighters, it can actually be really helpful to have a way to summon a weapon to us if, for example, we've needed to drop it as part of switching to a different weapon. It also emphasises our bond with certain weapons, which I really like, and there are circumstantial benefits to being able to go somewhere without a weapon, and then being able to summon it at will. For our bonded weapons, though, consider bonding to one of our darts as well as our melee Kensei weapon. For our ability score increase or feat, we could increase our constitution to make ourselves more tanky, although I'd maybe consider picking up mobile as a feat. As a switch fighter, it would be helpful to be able to move in and out of melee at will. That and the extra movement feels nice on a build which otherwise hasn't been able to benefit from Monk's additional movement. Or we might take Warcaster so we can consistently cast spells with our hands full. This way we could then stack our shield with Agile Parry and the shield spell to reach really high armor classes. It would also give us advantage on saving throws to maintain concentration, which complements our proficiency in those saves. And when we get an opportunity attack, with Warcaster we could then cast a spell like Booming Blade, which is fantastic on a tank build as it discourages creatures from moving away from us. That, or maybe we could cast Hunter's Mark on them to set us up for our next round of damage. Or we might pick up Resilient Wisdom to round out our wisdom score and pick up a useful saving throw. Because of Dread Ambusher, it would also boost our initiative by 1, bringing our overall initiative bonus to +4, which is pretty good considering we don't have that high a dexterity. At this point, we will probably stop taking Ranger or Fighter levels, as we don't gain a lot from level 5 as we already have extra attack. Although there is probably a case to be made for picking up 2nd level spells from Ranger. We might consider picking up some Cleric levels. This will give us access to more armor class boosts such as Shield of Faith, and if we go with War Cleric we could grab Divine Favour, which pairs really nicely with Kensei Shot to stack lots of damage buffs on top of each other. While Divine Favour only does a d4 of extra damage compared to Hunter's Mark's d6, once we cast it, we can reliably add that damage to all the attacks we make, as it doesn't require that we target a particular creature. This would then free up our bonus action on all future rounds for Kensei Shot. Alternatively, if we went with something like the Forge Domain Cleric, we could add an additional +1 to our armor class by having Blessing of the Forge on our armor. However, on balance, I would probably focus on taking more monk levels. This gives us more key and defensive features, as well as gets us additional ability score increases. This way, by level 20, we'll have 12 levels of monk, 4 in Ranger and 4 in Fighter. The additional monk levels would give us evasion to help us mitigate dexterity saving throw based damage. It would give us stillness of mind to help us shake off fear or charm effects. We'd also gain the ability to move along walls or across water if we have taken our armor off. Combining this feature with the jump spell and action surge could be used to pull off some really crazy acrobatics. We'll gain Purity of Body at level 10 to become immune to poison, and at level 19 overall, we would gain the Way of the Kensei's Sharpen the Blade feature. This is a hard ability to make work with our darts, unless at this point we've convinced our Dungeon Master to give us a magical dart that returns to us after we throw it. But failing that, what we could do is use Sharpen the Blade on an ordinary dart to give it a +3 to attack and damage rolls, and then use Weapon Bond to return it to us on a bonus action. More likely though, I'd consider using Sharpen the Blade on our longbow, which by this point should be a Kensei weapon for us. While our dexterity modifier is only a +2, using Sharpen the Blade on it will make that modifier equivalent to a +5, meaning that we would have as good accuracy as our darts, but obviously with a much greater range, allowing us to get the most out of it in large-scale combats, which we very well might experience in the later tiers of play. Finally, at 20th level, we can end with another feat or ability score increase. Just pick your favourite at this point. Something dramatic that we haven't been able to use up until this point might be good though. Perhaps Fey Touched or Shadow Touched for some interesting additional spells, or the Tough Feat to really bolster our tanking abilities. Whatever it is, I feel like you could just have fun with it at this point. This was a long video, but this finally concludes our dive into how to optimize the Way of the Kensei Monk. This was a really big challenge to optimize, but I'm really happy with how it came out, as I feel we've managed to make something unique Not many builds can claim to really master melee, ranged, damage dealing and tanking all in one package. And we were able to stay true to the theme of the Kensei, of this samurai warrior who masters all forms of martial arts. They can even throw shurikens, which is so cool! Thank you for staying to the end of the video. I really appreciate your comments, so please do let me know your thoughts on this build and how you'd perhaps do things differently. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more of this content. Thank you, students, and I look forward to seeing you in class next time. Potentially incorporate some really reliable grappling and tripling in. And if we had this in mind, we'd potentially have chosen a rapier as our melee Kensei weapon. Create some really reliable grappling, that was annoying. Can't take a call right now.